The year was 1945, and Japan lay in ruins. Smoke still curled from the hollowed skeletons of cities that had once pulsed with imperial pride. Tokyo, once an orderly capital of lantern-lit streets and military parades, had become a charred labyrinth where children scavenged for scrap metal and mothers traded heirlooms for a handful of rice. Across the Pacific, the victorious Allies were gathering the remnants of an army that had been trained to die rather than surrender. But among the prisoners were women, young, disciplined, and fiercely private, who had stepped into the machinery of war not as soldiers on the front but as its unseen veins. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, translators. They had believed in an empire that promised eternal glory. Now they sat behind barbed wire, silent, their futures suspended in an alien language they could not read. One of them was Nakamura Yuki, only 23, once a nurse on Saipan. She had tended to wounded pilots who vowed to crash into American carriers, watching them write farewell notes with shaking hands before they limped back to their cockpits. When the U.S. Marines stormed the beaches, Yuki had expected to die. Instead, she was taken alive, dazed, clutching her small medical kit like a talisman. Her first sight of American soldiers, tall, loud, their helmets smudged with salt and sweat, was burned into her memory as deeply as the mushroom cloud photographs that would soon haunt every newspaper. Beside her in the barracks now sat Tanaka Fumiko, a clerk from the Japanese Navy's communications office in Manila. Fumiko had memorized code phrases, typed frantic orders as air raids roared overhead, and believed until the last moment that the Empire's divine will would prevail. She wore her hair tied back, perfectly neat even in captivity, but her fingers trembled when she folded letters to home, letters that would never be sent. Around them were dozens of other women whose lives had once been orderly, whose patriotism had been unquestioned. Here, surrounded by wooden walls and watchtowers, that certainty was unraveling. The camp was a strange, liminal world. Days were measured by the echo of boots on gravel and the clang of metal trays. Morning mist clung to the barracks as guards marched past in olive drab, their English words sharp and impenetrable. Meals came in tin plates, watery stew, hard bread, a few grains of rice when stocks allowed. The air smelled of damp wood and disinfectant. Nights were long and heavy with whispered fears, of trials, of shame, of what awaited them in a Japan that no longer resembled the one they had left. Yuki learned early to keep her face blank when the guards walked by. To flinch was weakness, to smile might be betrayal. Yet curiosity tugged at her. She watched the soldiers share cigarettes, laugh at jokes she couldn't decipher, sling rifles carelessly as if danger were a thing of the past. Fumiko, on the other hand, built a fortress of silence. She scribbled kanji on scraps of paper, replayed old propaganda songs in her head, and refused to meet the gaze of any man in uniform. They were, after all, the victors, and victory meant power, power that could humiliate. But it was not cruelty that defined the Americans here. There was a brisk efficiency, almost an indifference. These prisoners were no longer threats. They were loose ends to tie up before the great project of rebuilding could begin. Some guards were young farm boys from Kansas or Iowa, barely older than the women they watched. They carried themselves with a casual ease that puzzled Yuki. War had ended, yet they looked forward, not back. To them, she and her companions were curiosities, not enemies. One even nodded once, brief and almost shy, before passing out of sight. Outside the fences, the wider world was shifting. General Douglas MacArthur had begun his sweeping occupation, reshaping Japan's government, rewriting its constitution, introducing freedoms the empire had suppressed. Western newspapers arrived, their photographs strange and candid. New words filtered through the camp: democracy, reconstruction, re-education. None of it made sense to women who had grown up saluting the flag and whispering prayers to the emperor. For them, the humiliation was total. Their homeland conquered, their ideals exposed as fragile illusions. Yet life went on in the barracks, suspended between despair and a strange reluctant relief that the killing had stopped. The greatest enemy now was monotony. Without work or purpose, days blurred into each other. Some prisoners braided each other's hair, hummed lullabies from childhood. Others stared for hours at the horizon, where beyond the wire trucks rumbled, bringing supplies the women could not identify. Once, Yuki saw crates marked with a red script she didn't understand: Coca-Cola. The soldiers unloaded them with practiced ease, clinking glass against glass. She wondered if it was some kind of medicine or chemical. Fumiko dismissed it with a scoff. Another decadent Western drink. Yet a faint curiosity flickered. How strange that the conquerors carried crates of liquid like treasure. Letters from home, when they came, were sparse and sorrowful. Japan was starving. Cities were rubble. Fathers gone, brothers lost. The emperor's voice, once divine, had spoken over the radio, brittle and human, declaring surrender in words that many could barely comprehend. For Yuki, the memory of that broadcast was surreal. The man she had worshipped as a living god sounding weary, almost apologetic. It made the world tilt. If even the emperor could bow, what else might break? Despite the hunger and fear, a slow, reluctant transformation began. The guards brought newspapers with photographs of American families smiling beside automobiles and bright storefronts. Sometimes they played music, jazz and swing that floated through the barbed wire like signals from another planet. Yuki found herself listening when she thought no one noticed. The rhythm was unlike anything she knew. Free, unrestrained, alive. Fumiko tried to shut it out, but sometimes her foot tapped, traitorous and secret. And yet, distrust lingered. Rumors drifted through the camp of war criminals on trial, of harsh sentences for some, clemency for others. The women didn't know their own fates. Would they return home, or vanish into some foreign prison? The uncertainty gnawed at them more than hunger. Yuki dreamed of her mother's kitchen but woke each morning to the smell of damp straw. Fumiko imagined the Manila office where she once worked, but the past felt like a faded photograph, unreachable, already foreign. Then came small signs that the world outside the fence was changing faster than they realized. Soldiers no longer moved with the tense caution of occupiers. They laughed more, relaxed more, sometimes tossing candy to local children on the other side of the camp. A jeep pulled in one afternoon with crates of unfamiliar goods, boxes of powdered eggs, slabs of canned meat, sacks of flour. To the prisoners, it was simply another reminder of America's vast abundance. They had lost not just the war but the race of resources and industry. For Yuki, a turning point came one damp morning when she watched a soldier open one of those mysterious glass bottles from the earlier crates. He tipped it back, and there was a hiss, a sound like something alive escaping. The drink was dark, effervescent, unlike tea or broth. He grinned, wiped his mouth, and offered the bottle to another. The women watching did not move closer, but the sound stuck with her, sharp, cheerful, utterly alien. In that tiny noise, something shifted. The Empire had told her America was weak, decadent, doomed. Yet here was a simple pleasure, a confidence in abundance she could not ignore. She did not know it yet, but that faint curiosity, that wondering about a drink she had never seen, a taste she could not imagine, would soon collide with a far deeper revelation. War had ended with fire and surrender, but the real disarming of her world was only beginning, and it would arrive not through punishment or speeches, but through a sip and a bite that would challenge everything she had believed. The first time Yuki saw a Coca-Cola bottle up close, it was as if she were staring at a relic from another planet. The glass caught the weak winter light, brown liquid shimmering like polished amber, a white script curling around its middle in a language she could not read. It was passed casually from one soldier to another, the cap flicked off with a metallic snap. The hiss that followed seemed louder than it should have been, a sudden fizz that made her flinch before she caught herself. Fumiko, sitting beside her on the barrack step, murmured a dry comment in Japanese about decadent American sugar water. But Yuki could not look away. The soldier tilted the bottle and drank with an ease that felt theatrical, not for show, simply natural, the way someone drinks water after working in a field. It was a picture of comfort she had never associated with an enemy. Weeks earlier, crates of those bottles had arrived in long lines of military trucks. At first the women assumed the contents were fuel or disinfectant. The guards had no reason to explain. Only later did they hear its name spoken, Coke. Sometimes with fondness, sometimes with impatience when a crate cracked and bottles shattered. The Americans seemed to treat it like a lifeline, yet also like nothing special. That paradox fascinated Yuki. For her, luxury had always been something distant, reserved for officers or the emperor's household. Here, ordinary soldiers drank sweetness daily, unthinking. Coca-Cola had been born half a century earlier in Atlanta, a humble syrup turned into an empire of its own. By the 1940s it was no longer merely a drink, it was a symbol stitched into the fabric of American life. The company had promised U.S. soldiers that wherever they went, a bottle of Coke would be within reach, costing only 5 cents. Portable bottling plants followed armies across Europe and the Pacific like shadow supply lines. Where Marines dug foxholes, Coke trucks rumbled in behind them. Now, in occupied Japan, the ritual continued. America was rebuilding, and so was its favorite drink. For the women inside the camp, this was not just about taste, it was about dissonance. The Empire had told them Americans were soft, gluttonous, spiritually empty. Yet here was a nation that had flattened their cities and still found time to deliver comfort to its troops. Each bottle was a quiet message: our abundance endures even in war. Fumiko felt the sting of it keenly. She would watch the guards laughing over clinking bottles and think of the nights she had worked by candlelight, typing desperate orders as bombs shook the walls. Her empire had demanded sacrifice. There seemed to offer pleasure without shame. The first offer came on an ordinary afternoon. A young guard, his name lost to time, but his easy grin still vivid in Yuki's memory, approached the fence where a cluster of women stood. He held out a bottle through the wire, a playful gesture more than an act of generosity. None of them moved. Accepting anything felt dangerous, like betraying their homeland. But hunger and curiosity are patient forces. Finally, one woman, older and braver, stepped forward. She took the bottle, turned it in her hands, and looked back for permission she knew wouldn't come. The guard gestured how to drink. She hesitated, then sipped. The reaction was almost comical. Her eyes widened. She coughed at the carbonation, then laughed despite herself, a quick, startled sound none of them had heard in months. Sweetness bloomed where bitterness had lived too long. The others erupted in whispers, half scandal, half wonder. Fumiko scoffed but leaned closer. Yuki felt something strange stir inside her, not quite longing, not quite jealousy. More a realization that the world outside their walls might be bigger and more complex than propaganda had painted. After that, small exchanges began. A bottle left on a fence post. A shy offer from a guard passing by. Some women refused, holding to pride like a final shield. Others accepted and hid their delight, sipping in secret behind the barracks. For Yuki, the first taste was unforgettable. Cold, sharp, effervescent, it felt alive on her tongue, a shock of sugar and spice she could not name. She thought of her childhood belief that Westerners were barbarians. The drink in her hand told another story. It was simple, joyful, utterly ordinary, and somehow powerful. Fumiko resisted longest. Each time Yuki returned with a half-empty bottle and quiet eyes, Fumiko reminded her, "They are feeding you sweetness so you forget defeat." Yet one evening, after a long day of nothing but watery soup, she asked to try a sip. The first swallow startled her into a sharp inhale. She muttered something about it being too sweet but took another taste before handing it back. Yuki saw the corners of her mouth twitch upward, just slightly. Something had cracked. Beyond the camp, a larger game was unfolding. General MacArthur and his staff understood that conquest alone could not remake Japan. They needed hearts to shift, not just laws. Food and culture became tools of quiet persuasion. Coca-Cola, with its easy cheer and industrial reach, was perfect. Soon bottling plants were being assembled in Tokyo itself, an investment in both commerce and influence. The drink that had refreshed GIs on jungle battlefields was about to flood the land of their former enemy. For the prisoners, these developments were invisible but felt. Supplies grew more varied. Rumors spread of new factories, new freedoms, new ways of life beyond the fence. Yuki began to imagine Tokyo not as ashes but as a place where children might one day taste the same fizz she had. Fumiko hated the thought but could not stop it. Each night, she wrestled with the sense that her understanding of strength and weakness was unraveling. The Empire had demanded suffering and obedience. The Americans seemed to wield laughter and sugar as weapons. Not everyone welcomed this subtle invasion. Some women clung fiercely to pride, refusing every bottle, warning others not to be seduced. "They want to tame you," one hissed. "Don't drink their victory." And perhaps she was right. Yet the human heart is complicated. After years of scarcity and fear, the smallest kindness can feel revolutionary. A sip of something cold and sweet was not surrender. It was relief, and relief can open doors propaganda once kept locked. Yuki noticed herself changing in quiet ways. She no longer stiffened every time a guard passed. She listened to the music that sometimes drifted from their radios, trying to catch the beat. She felt curiosity instead of hatred. Fumiko noticed too, and it frightened her. "Don't forget who we are," she whispered one night. But even she could not deny the strange peace that came with knowing the war was truly over. The Coca-Cola bottles kept coming. Ordinary and miraculous all at once. They were never officially given as gifts. They simply appeared, tokens of a new world seeping through cracks in the old one. Each sip carried a whisper. Your captors are not the monsters you were told. They live differently, and they have won. Yet even as sweetness spread, another scent began drifting over the camp walls, heavier, richer, more tantalizing than any soda could be. Yuki first smelled it on a breezy afternoon. Smoke, charred meat, something sizzling on metal. It was warm and foreign and made her stomach tighten with both hunger and suspicion. Fumiko smelled it too and frowned, though her gaze lingered longer than she intended. Beyond the fences, soldiers were grilling something she had never seen, something that crackled with fat and fire. If Coca-Cola had unsettled their beliefs, this aroma promised an even deeper challenge, a feast from a world that had already remade theirs. Tea began with a smell unlike anything Yuki had known. One cool spring afternoon, wind carried it over the wire. Smoke tinged with sweetness, salt, and something animal. It was not the faint fish broth of home or the starch of boiling rice. This was heavy, rich, alive with fat meeting flame. She stood at the edge of the yard, eyes half closed, and felt her stomach clench. Fumiko noticed too, stiffening as though the scent itself were an invasion. Beyond the fence, a handful of American soldiers laughed around a metal drum turned into a grill. Grease hissed and popped. A soldier flipped a dark patty with a flat spatula. The sound was hypnotic, the smell intoxicating and confusing all at once. For Yuki, food had always meant discipline. Measured rice portions, humble miso, a rare egg on festival days. Wartime scarcity had stripped even those comforts away. She remembered chewing dried sweet potato until her jaw ached, counting each grain of rice in hospital rations while bombs fell nearby. The idea of meat thick enough to sizzle was almost mythic. Yet here it was. Real, close, in the hands of men who had defeated her nation and now feasted with casual joy. The first time she saw a hamburger, she didn't know its name. A soldier bit into the bun and juices ran down his chin. He laughed and wiped his face with the back of his hand. The patty gleamed with melted cheese, something she had only read about in censored cookbooks. It was vulgar, excessive, and mesmerizing. Fumiko watched with quiet disdain, arms crossed, but Yuki sensed her friend's curiosity beneath the scowl. Hunger was a powerful traitor. Soon rumors spread. The guard's mess hall was serving these strange meat sandwiches. Some prisoners whispered that it was cow flesh ground into cakes, others that it might be horse or some chemical invention. The mystery made it both repulsive and magnetic. For women raised on tales of Japan's sacred rice culture, the notion of eating beef this way, in a bun, with sauces, felt almost sacrilegious. Yet every time the breeze shifted, the smell curled into the barracks like an invitation. One day an unexpected opportunity arrived. A guard, the same one who had first shared Coca-Cola, approached with an easy grin and a tray. On it sat 2 steaming sandwiches, their buns soft and pale against the dark, seared meat. He gestured toward Yuki and Fumiko, encouraging with a nod. Yuki's hands trembled. Accepting was dangerous. It could feel like surrender. But hunger and curiosity battled pride until, almost without realizing, she stepped forward. Fumiko hissed her name, but did not stop her. The warmth of the bun shocked her palms. Steam escaped as she lifted it, carrying scents of charred beef and sharp mustard. She hesitated, heart racing. Then she took a bite. The taste was a revelation. Smoky, juicy, impossibly rich. Salt and grease mingled with tangy sauce in a way she had never imagined. It filled her mouth with a decadence that felt both shameful and miraculous. Tears pricked her eyes, though she could not say why. Perhaps it was the shock of pleasure after so many months of scarcity, or the sudden knowledge that the enemy's world was not only powerful but abundant, joyful even in small things. She swallowed and exhaled, dizzy with conflicting emotions. Fumiko wavered, watching Yuki's face shift from caution to astonishment. Pride held her still for a moment longer. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like defeat, she accepted the second sandwich. Her first bite was hesitant, then deeper. A small noise escaped her throat, not quite a moan, but something close to wonder. She tried to mask it with a frown, but Yuki saw the truth. She was moved. The food they had been taught to disdain was extraordinary. For the rest of the day, they said little. Shame tangled with gratitude, confusion with relief. Was this simple meal an act of kindness or a quiet conquest? Yuki thought of the Empire's strict diet of sacrifice, of how she had once believed suffering proved strength. Yet here was nourishment without ceremony, flavor without guilt. Fumiko stared at the dirt floor long after the last bite, as if searching for a reason to despise what she had just enjoyed. The next weeks brought more encounters. Sometimes a guard left scraps, bits of bun, stray patties, where women might take them without speaking. Sometimes they were invited to try openly, though few dared. Each taste chipped at the old certainties. Yuki began to imagine a future not built on obedience and scarcity but on choice and comfort. Fumiko resisted, but cracks widened. One evening, she whispered that the Empire had promised strength but never fed its daughters like this. It was a bitter confession, quiet and raw. Beyond the wire, the smell of grilling became a symbol. It meant not just food but the reach of an entirely different life. The Americans did not try to convert the women with lectures or threats. They let abundance speak. The sizzling patties, the easy laughter, the casual sharing of what had once seemed impossible. These things carried a message sharper than any propaganda. Power, it turned out, could taste good. Yuki felt herself changing. The war had taken her youth and filled it with fear. Now, in this strange captivity, she was tasting a world she had been told was rotten and finding it unexpectedly human. She began to see the guards not only as conquerors but as men. Some kind, some clumsy, some simply young and alive. Fumiko struggled more, clinging to anger, yet even she could not unremember the taste of that first burger. One evening, as dusk turned the sky violet, Yuki caught Fumiko staring toward the mess hall, where smoke curled lazily into the air. Her friend's eyes were hard, but her lips parted as if she might speak. Instead, she turned away. Yuki understood. Something profound was shifting inside both of them, something that could not yet be voiced. And still, the scent lingered, heavy with promise and danger alike. It was not just food. It was the smell of a different world pressing against the fragile shell of what they had been taught. If Coca-Cola had cracked the door, this rich, sizzling air was prying it wider, daring them to step through. Neither Yuki nor Fumiko could know how far that invitation would reach once the fences opened, and they returned to a homeland hungrier for change than anyone yet realized. When freedom finally came, it arrived quietly, almost without ceremony. One morning the gate swung open, and an officer announced that the women would be processed for release. There were no fanfares, no speeches, only the rustle of clothing as they packed their meager belongings and the silent weight of a future they could not picture. Yuki stood among them, thin but upright, clutching the same small medical kit she had carried since Saipan. Fumiko kept her face unreadable, though her hands trembled as she tied the string around a bundle of papers she had hoarded through captivity. The war was over. Their empire was gone. They were stepping back into a homeland they no longer understood. Japan itself felt like another country. Trains rattled through shattered cities. Children with hollow eyes begged for scraps. Posters promised new democracy, and American jeeps rolled past with easy confidence. For Yuki, every corner smelled of change. Black market stalls selling tins of Spam, cigarette smoke curling over stalls of rice and sweet potatoes, occasional bottles of Coke gleaming like treasure behind improvised counters. She had tasted that fizz in captivity and now saw it on crowded streets, no longer contraband but a symbol of survival. The occupation's quiet cultural tide was spreading, and she could feel it tugging at her own loyalties. Fumiko, however, met the new world with clenched teeth. Returning to Tokyo, she found her neighborhood half destroyed, her family reduced to silence and scarcity. Her father, once proud of her Navy post, avoided her eyes when she spoke of the camp. He could not forgive her capture, though he never said so aloud. To him, America was humiliation embodied. Yet even Fumiko could not escape its reach. The small office where she found clerical work was already awash with American words: budget, meeting, project. Radios played swing and jazz as though it were natural. And at lunch, co-workers whispered about a new treat, hamburgers served at stalls near the Ginza district. She pretended to scoff, but her throat tightened at the memory of that first bite. Yuki's transition was gentler. She returned to a mother who wept and held her, grateful simply that she lived. To help with expenses, Yuki took work at a small clinic treating malnourished children and veterans. There she met relief workers, some American, some Japanese trained by U.S. doctors, who shared canned milk and medicine. One afternoon a nurse offered her a bottle of Coke, cold from an icebox. Yuki hesitated, then accepted, feeling the strange déjà vu of that first sip in the camp. It no longer tasted like the enemy. It tasted like survival, even hope. She did not know whether to feel guilty. Yet guilt and curiosity often traveled together in those years. Every day brought reminders that the past was gone. Factories rose where ashes had been, shop windows filled with foreign goods. On street corners, boys in patched uniforms hawked Coca-Cola caps as trinkets. And above all, America's culture seeped in without speeches, through food, music, and small comforts. Yuki sometimes caught herself humming a swing tune while cleaning bandages. Fumiko noticed too, shaking her head with half-hearted scorn. "You've gone soft," she would tease when they met, though there was no malice in it. Their friendship became a mirror of Japan's own struggle. Yuki was quietly pragmatic, drawn toward whatever eased suffering, even if it meant tasting the conqueror's world. Fumiko wrestled with pride like a wound that refused to close. But pride alone could not fill an empty stomach or rebuild a shattered city. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she found herself changing. The first time she walked alone to a street vendor and bought a hamburger, she told herself it was only hunger. Yet as she ate, standing among strangers who also chewed in silence, she felt something unspoken pass between them, not surrender, but survival. She was not alone in her conflicted desire for comfort. Years later, both women would remember a single night that felt like a quiet turning point. They met at a riverside where Tokyo's neon signs now blinked against dark water. Children chased each other past food stalls. The air smelled of frying meat and sweet soda. Yuki brought 2 glass bottles, still cold, and handed one to Fumiko. For a moment her friend hesitated, caught between memory and present. Then she took it, pried the cap off with a coin, and drank. The hiss of carbonation was soft but unmistakable. Yuki saw her eyes close, just for a heartbeat, as if letting go of some ancient tension. When she opened them again, there was no smile, but neither was there resistance. Something had shifted. It was not that they had forgotten the pain of war. The loss still lived in them, in the names of brothers carved into stone, in nights haunted by air raid sirens. But the taste of new things had built a bridge between what was lost and what might be built. America's power had not come only from bombs or treaties. It had arrived in sweetness, warmth, and the smell of a hot meal when the world was cold. It was insidious and undeniable, yet also strangely human. Fumiko would later tell Yuki, half laughing, half bitter, "We were conquered twice, first by their weapons, then by their plenty." But even as she said it, she took another sip of Coke. Yuki smiled, hearing not defeat but weary acceptance. They had survived, and survival demanded adaptation. As Tokyo thrummed with the pulse of rebuilding, the 2 women stood together at the edge of the river, listening to distant jazz and the hum of neon. They were no longer prisoners, yet the taste of captivity lingered, not as shame, but as memory of a door that had opened. Once, they had believed strength meant austerity and sacrifice. Now they understood another kind of strength, the power of a culture confident enough to share pleasure even with its enemies. A gust of wind carried the smell of grilled meat across the water, mingled with the sweet tang of soda. Yuki looked at Fumiko and saw not the rigid clerk she had met in the barracks, but a woman softened by survival, still proud yet capable of change. Fumiko met her gaze and nodded once, a silent truce with the world as it was. In that moment, they both sensed a truth larger than victory or defeat, that empires fall, but small human hungers endure, and sometimes the quietest forces remake a nation. Far behind them, somewhere in the night, a bottle cap popped and fizzed. It sounded like the future arriving.